Hello, my name's Bob, the Bookerer, and I have set myself the very foolish challenge of going through all of the Booker Prize shortlists from the last 50 plus years. Today, I really wanted to do a deep dive into 1979, throw it back a little bit after doing 2020. 1979 saw Margaret Thatcher become Prime Minister of the UK, the first female Prime Minister, and it was also a time of a lot of other changes and upheaval. So it almost seems quite ridiculous in some ways to be focusing on a book prize. But that book prize had its own controversies of the year, which again, to anybody maybe outside of that world, seem a bit ridiculous. But it was a very important year for a certain author, Miss Penelope Fitzgerald, who won with her novel Offshore. Now, with every Booker shortlist, you see there being a comparison between the shortlisted novels, as if there's an expectation that there'll be some kind of similarity to them, and often there is. You know, in some shortlists, people have spoken a lot about how there's a central theme around mothers, as of the 2020 list, or how there is, for example, a lot of violence, how it's a particularly violent year. The 1979 shortlist just feels like quite a weird mix, really. You've got Thomas Keneally's Confederates, a novel which is about the American Civil War, and is about you know, kind of warring factions and about these kind of characters and their quests to survive in this brand new creation of the US, as it's kind of up and coming. You have V.S. Naipaul with A Bend in the River, a novel that concerns itself a lot with issues of race, empire, colonialism, post-colonialism, all in this sort of fictional town. And kind of linked to that, you've also got the fact that V.S. Naipaul had by that point already won a Booker Prize. And so there was this interesting controversy around whether he should be allowed to win a second time. He was potentially seen as the first contender to have that title. And it's interesting that at that time he was seen as such a heavyweight that he was automatically the bookies' favourite. You also have Julian Rathbone's Joseph, a historical fiction novel taking place over about 600 pages and many, many years, following this character through sort of trials and tribulations along a long and quite bizarre life. Then you have Fay Weldon's Praxis, a novel following a woman called Praxis throughout her life and through the trials and tribulations she has. And she has this really horrible, difficult life in many, many parts. A lot of people take a lot of advantage of her. There's also a lot of warmth and humor and joy to be found in it. And ultimately we're forced to sort of reckon with her as a character who has done horrible, almost unforgivable things, but we're presented with this idea of, can we actually forgive her as a character? It's all done with Fay Weldon's typical humor and joy and really nuanced thoughts, particularly around the internal lives of women. I've only ever read The Life and Loves of a She-Devil by her before, but I am reliably informed that a lot of Fay Weldon's work really concerns itself around these topics, and she does it so well. Praxis really delves in deeply to this idea of a really challenged and problematic woman, but in a way where we kind of love her. So I think it's a really interesting novel, and a very, I mean, it would make any list it was on seem a bit weird and uncoordinated, but I think it was an absolutely wonderful touch for this shortlist. And then that finally brings us to Offshore by Penelope Fitzgerald, which won. That is an incredibly short novel, so it's about 50,000 words, about 140 or so pages. It is about a woman who, following the breakup of her marriage, starts to live on a houseboat with her children. She is not very well prepared for this. Lots of things happen that kind of undermine her existence. It just gets tougher and tougher, but she has the friendships around her with these other people who live on the river, also in their houseboats. And it's a really beautiful portrayal of those lives, but also a very funny and very sharp look at those, again, the kind of internal life of this woman. Again, we're not always meant to think of her as particularly redeemable. There are many qualities about her that are quite difficult and quite strange. And yet there she is, living on this houseboat, and, you know, a disaster strikes and the houseboat sinks. which is actually really interesting. This mirrors Penelope Fitzgerald's life herself. I was reading a really good biography of her by Hermione Lee, and it really details how many of the things that happen in Penelope Fitzgerald's life get mirrored in her novels about sort of 20 or so years later. So Penelope Fitzgerald goes on this sort of study program to Russia for a while, and later writes a bit about Russia. She lives on a houseboat which also sinks. That is brought into it. Her struggles with debt and with finance, and with a husband who is financially insecure and not very good, really, in all fairness. That also comes up in Offshore. But at that time of writing, Penelope Fitzgerald was just somebody who had been nominated for the Booker Prize the year before, was not a particularly well-known author, and this win came as a massive surprise. Now, I have to confess, part of the reason I'm covering 1979 so early, apart from the fact that I read it not long ago, probably near the beginning of lockdown, I think it was, is that this is actually a fairly fundamental part of why I started reading all of the shortlists of all of the Booker Prizes as well. I told myself I was just going to read all the winners. I picked up Penelope Fitzgerald's Offshore because, in all honesty, it was in the library, it was short, and I was just a bit tired, and I just thought, you know what, let's knock this one out. Let's just quickly read Penelope Fitzgerald's Offshore. And then I loved it. I absolutely adored her style of writing. The novel is so short that in some ways I felt a little bit cheated by the end, because I think I wanted a little bit more of some parts. But it's a novel that I know I'm going to go back and reread, especially as it's so short. It's nice and easy to do so. Penelope Fitzgerald just has this really wry and genius sense of humor. Everything is very well observed. She gets into the minds of characters and will often beat you to the punch with a joke just a little bit before you get there. So you're sort of being set up and you're not quite sure what for or why or how, but she does it, and then suddenly you find yourself laughing. And Offshore, despite all of the tragedy that comes up in the novel, is an incredibly enjoyable and fun and funny read. She has a character who, her main character befriends this man who lives on a boat, who is essentially, for all intents and purposes, a rent boy or a male prostitute of some form. And he uses his boat as the place for all operations, essentially. And it's just so subtly done. It's, you know, I think there's a real temptation with novels around that time when writing about gay men, and particularly gay men who have sex and kind of own their sexuality, for them to be subjects of mockery or of criticism in some form, where they're seen as a bit ridiculous. But here, all of the characters are so ridiculous that actually he comes through as this really warm, empathetic, human character. And I really appreciated her giving that kind of sense of joy to it all. And it was because I enjoyed that novel so much, because I really loved Offshore, that I then went and decided to read more of Penelope Fitzgerald. And again, this is what the prize is for, as well as picking one top novel, sometimes two, of a year. It's a really great way of exposing readers, like myself, like you hopefully as well, to lots of new authors. And Penelope Fitzgerald is an author I had never heard of, who I'm convinced I would probably never really have come round to had it not been for this. As a result, I started reading more of her back catalogue, particularly the rest of her Booker-nominated books. And there's just such an incredible gift in Penelope Fitzgerald's writing. It's a joy to read for me. I'll cover her separately as well as a video of just about Penelope Fitzgerald's work. And her as an author, but she's a fascinating woman. She wrote for many years, but mostly for sort of radio and television, and for the BBC more generally, which is also brought up in another one of her novels, Human Voices, which talks a lot about the radio. And she is really a really fascinating character, because although she was doing that kind of writing, she didn't start novels until she was a fair bit older. I think she was in her 40s or 50s when she started writing novels and getting them published. So to win the Booker Prize so early into her writing career, but so late into her life, is a really interesting parallel. It's a really interesting signal about just the quality of her writing, and about how I mean, myself as someone who writes, I get really quite worried sometimes when I see, you know, these brand new authors coming out who not worried, I feel insecure. Like, you know, these authors coming out who are in their early 20s and have brought out these amazing books. And I just think, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Like, how am I so far behind? The imposter syndrome kicks in where I'm like, maybe I'm just not that good. Maybe I'm not, who knows? But I think it's really refreshing to see an author come into her prime and come into writing at, you know, in her 40s or 50s and just absolutely master the form, in my opinion. She was nominated 4 times for the Booker Prize, and there was a 5th novel, The Blue Flower, that many people still hold as one of the books that should have been nominated and should have won, perhaps, but never was. And that was her final novel. So it's a really interesting win. Now, also in this biography, a really interesting thing to bring up is, as I mentioned, she was not the favourite. Many people did not think Penelope Fitzgerald had a chance at all. In fact, one of the judges, Hilary Sperling, mentions in a Guardian article about how Penelope Fitzgerald's Offshore was chosen as the winner because all of the judges were at loggerheads about every single other top choice that they had. Penelope Fitzgerald was nobody's first choice in that race. However, she was everybody's second choice. And when nobody else could decide between some of the other novels, particularly V.S. Naipaul's Bend in the River, which the people who loved it thought that it really grew the form of fiction and of what novels can be. And detractors from it thought, well, you know, he's won the prize already. Is that fair? He's already such a big name. Is that fair? And even, is this novel even a novel? It kind of almost feels in some ways like it's a couple of short stories. It takes a slightly different form to many other novels that we're used to. But what's quite funny is that was seen as experimental for the time, whereas fast forward to 2019 and Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other wins the prize, and people think, yeah, it's a bit experimental. It's amazing how fast over those 40 years, how much of a change there has been in terms of what we see as experimental or as what a novel even can be. So I think it's really exciting that someone like Penelope Fitzgerald was given that chance. I think it's also really exciting that people like V.S. Naipaul went in the race. However, as I mentioned, that was a bit of a controversial win, and that really dogged Penelope Fitzgerald for much of her life. You know, it was referred to in the biography that something that actually I've heard, I think Julian Barnes spoke about after he won the Booker Prize, and his advice to any new Booker Prize winning authors was, from now on, you will always be known as Booker Prize winning author blah. And that happened to Julian Barnes, where he sort of felt that, you know, for all of the writing he'd been doing for many of his years, and his writing is incredible, in my opinion, he was now seen as just Booker Prize winning author Julian Barnes. And Penelope Fitzgerald had that for quite a while, but what also dogged her as part of that was that nobody had seen her winning. Nobody had expected it. And so the controversy around the Booker Prize immediately after was this deserved? And in fact, she was actually invited, I feel really bad for Penelope on this, she was invited to this panel interview, basically the moment after the Booker Prize win was announced. And they had been expecting V.S. Naipaul to take it. And so the whole interview setup had been, let's talk about V.S. Naipaul, let's talk about Bend in the River, let's talk about some of the other books. And the idea had been to get some of the other shortlisted novels to talk about some of the novels they liked. However, what that then ended up meaning was you had this rather aggressive interviewer who spoke a lot about other novels and didn't really recognize Penelope Fitzgerald at all in the room, and basically spoke to her only to ask her maybe the odd question about her writing, but mostly to ask her about A Bend in the River or about any of the other shortlisted novels. And as a result, she keenly felt that shame, and the media furore around it. I say furore, I mean, it wasn't crazily big news, but the media attention around it at the time really hampered her and really made her feel less than, because essentially all of the articles being run were shock winner, you know, did she really deserve this? It's just a, you know, a 140-page novel about a woman on a riverboat. And it's important to kind of acknowledge as part of that the role that sexism probably played in that conversation. The fact that you had in that same race 3 fairly well-established male authors, Julian Rathbone, who published a lot of historical fiction, V.S. Naipaul, who had won the Booker before and later went on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and William Keneally, who also has actually ended up being someone who's nominated for the Booker Prize many, many times, won the Booker Prize with Schindler's Ark, is just an author that was very well respected. And Fay Weldon, being an author who sort of was proudly feminist and writing about a really troubled and really messy female character, and Penelope Fitzgerald also writing about a messy female character in a rather short novel. I think in many ways, Fay Weldon and Penelope Fitzgerald were kind of sidelined and were kind of just seen as, oh, you know, there we go, with some sort of piddling, feminine woman's novel. And I think as a result, that win was sort of even more of a surprise and really threw a lot of people's noses out of joint. Is that the phrase? Something like that. But I think it's worth kind of noticing the role that sexism would have played in that. And so you have these 5 novels in contention next to each other, and it just feels like a really weird list. I'm sure I will say this about many, many other lists that come, but these feel like novels that all belong in very different time periods. So not only because the historical novels we've got do deal with very different time periods, but they all, many of them feel like they belong to a sort of old guard of literature in terms of their subject matters. Right, so Julian Rathbone is this, this big sweeping 600-page historical novel about a character, but at the same time it has a lot of very sexual elements that feel definitely like it's beginning to be cutting edge, and it's not just consoling itself with being a very sort of straight up historical novel. You've got V.S. Naipaul writing a sort of post-colonial novel, which in 1979 would have still been at a real cutting edge of that being incredibly powerful politically. Obviously it still is now, but that would have been quite early into a lot of post-colonial writing and of a lot of previous Commonwealth and Empire states writing back and really kind of reshaping the world of literature. At the same time, you've got William Keneally's novel Confederates, all about the American Civil War, and again that just actually feels like that kind of novel feels like it could be in any Booker Prize shortlist, and I don't mean that as an insult to it, even though I really didn't like it. I think it's an historical novel about a very specific period of time, and it didn't necessarily, in my mind at least, it doesn't necessarily matter whether this was in the 1979 shortlist or in the 1969 shortlist or a bit later or wherever. And so I think kind of within that, it's quite exciting to have Fay Weldon, who is just such a creative mind and such a funny, warm, intentionally quite provocative and challenging author, with this character Praxis, who you're not really meant to like, but you kind of do. And her alongside Penelope Fitzgerald with Offshore, which is written in this very, I don't want to say traditional, it feels like it fits a very specific age of novels, but always still feels very current and very funny and very warm to me. And so it's just such a weird list. It doesn't feel like it belongs together, but ultimately it does, and it did. And I am really very pleasantly surprised in many ways that Penelope Fitzgerald won. If I were to judge the list myself, if I were one of the judges in 1979, at least being me now, I would still have Penelope Fitzgerald, I think, as the winner, with Praxis a close second. For me, both of those novels are just so warm and human and funny. And I think they've stood the test of time, for me personally, much better than perhaps some of the others. I have to admit, I found Confederates and Joseph by Julian Rathbone a real struggle. Partly they're fairly long, but I just couldn't really get into them. I think it was also fairly early into lockdown, so that may have had a big role to play in it. But yeah, I really struggled with those. V.S. Naipaul's A Bend in the River I thought was really enjoyable, really clever. I know there have been some criticisms leveled at it, but I think he is a really interesting author and often finds quite unique ways to flip the script, particularly in terms of talking about empire and race and colonialism. And so I think this is a really good novel that's also kind of stood the test of time to some degree. those issues are still as important as ever, and still really need to be put to the forefront of what we're talking about when we're talking about books, when we're talking about these things widely. So those are my thoughts about the 1979 Booker Prize. It's interesting for me to do these sort of deep dives and look backs over past awards, particularly ones like this, which took place over 40 years ago, to see which of these novels have really survived the test of time and which ones that modern day readers would still really connect to in a really powerful and important way. I think that's especially interesting as well, given thinking about the 2020 shortlist and long list. Are these novels that in 20, 30 years time we're still going to be talking about, that might still be studied, that might still be loved and engaged with by many people? Or are some of them novels that might just sort of disappear a little bit for many people? I'd be really intrigued to see which novels in a while really still stick with us. I wouldn't be surprised if certain ones of them, like Shuggy Bane, for example, or Burnt Sugar, are still very much seen as beloved books in the future. And I'd be really intrigued to see which ones we will quite easily forget about, if at all any of them. Perhaps none of them will. I'd be really pleased to hear your thoughts. I'd really love to hear what you thought about perhaps any of these novels that I've mentioned today in the 1979 shortlist. And I'd really love and really encourage you to go back and read some of them, particularly, in my opinion, Fay Weldon and Penelope Fitzgerald. I think they're both fantastic authors with a lot to say, and a real humour and warmth and humanity that comes through in their writing. So they were personal joys of mine. But I'd love to hear what you think. So take care, and please do enjoy reading. I've been Bob the Bookerer, and have a great day.